Okay, good evening, everyone. It's 6:05. It's a good moment to make a start. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, and it's my pleasure to chair this evening's seminar presentation by our speaker, Caitlin Schroering. Now, Caitlin joined the University of North Carolina in Charlotte in 2022. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Pittsburgh, a Master's of Arts in Latin American Studies from the University of Florida, and a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies from Denison University. Her research coalesces around multiple areas of social inquiry, including environmental sociology, resource conflicts, the human right to water, political economy, and transnational social movements using feminist and anti-colonial research methodologies. Her primary line of research is based on extensive fieldwork with two movements fighting against water privatization, one in Brazil and one in the United States. And it's those movements, I believe, Caitlin, we're also going to hear about in this evening seminar presentation, because Caitlin has just recently, in the autumn last year, published a book with Manchester University Press called Global Solidarities Against Water Grabbing. Without water, we have nothing. And of course, without water, we have nothing is the title of this evening's presentation. Now, we are going to proceed in the usual manner for CSSGJ. Caitlin will have about 35 to 40 minutes or thereabouts for your presentation. And then afterwards, we have a similar amount of time for questions, comments, and of course also for answers by you, Caitlin. So Caitlin, over to you, please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Andreas. And I'm really glad to be here with you all. So thank you for the invitation to start off this seminar series. There's a great lineup, so I'm looking forward to attending the other talks as well. Let me share my screen here. Hopefully that all goes smoothly. We tested it out. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, very good.
Yes.
All clear. Thank you, Caitlin.
All right, perfect. So I will come back to what this image is here later in the presentation, or I'll talk more about it, but this is actually where a dam collapsed in Brumadinho, Minas Gerais in Brazil in very early 2019. And I'll be talking about that in the latter part of the presentation. Oh, where is it? There we go. So this is the book that Andreas noted that I recently published, and the title for today is that subtitle, Without Water, We Have Nothing. So I wanted to just quickly give an overview kind of where I'm going today. So given the audience and kind of the theme of social and global justice, I am going to talk a little bit about how I came to this project, and then give a quick kind of overview of the book, and then talk about this topic sequentially, more or less, as the book does. However, you'll see I'm actually going to discuss they're not quite in order, and that makes more sense for this presentation. I think it will all fall together as we go along. So a little bit of background on me then to start. I have been committed and involved in organizing and activism around various social and environmental justice efforts, particularly becoming very engaged in college and seeing these two issues of social and environmental issues, kind of exploitation of humans and the environment, as interconnected. And had the opportunity in 2008, as part of my undergrad college experience, to study abroad in Brazil, which was the first time I was in Brazil. And mostly I was in the Amazon region of the country. And this is where I really saw and had to kind of confront firsthand the predatory and egregious behavior of many US-based corporations, and it's not just US-based ones, but and the impact of extractivism and bauxite mining. And kind of came back and felt a bit paralyzed by that and decided that I was going to work on organizing and social justice issues closer to home in the US. And so following college, I worked as a community organizer in Jacksonville, Florida for 4 years. And I did not think I was going to go into academia. In fact, my plan had been law school. And the more time I spent organizing, though, the more I started missing the research and teaching environment, but also wanted the chance to explore in more depth how social movements organize and what tactics and strategies are effective at bringing about social change. And so that's kind of the very short story of how I ended up deciding to pursue graduate studies, and ultimately, after doing an MA at University of Florida, deciding I really wanted to focus on social movement studies specifically, and so chose a program focused on that, and then very quickly realized, okay, there's a bit of a difference here between the study of social movements and social movement studies, particularly, I argue, and I talk about this in the book as well, US-based social movement studies, and then being a participant in social movements. And so that tension for me, and often what I've now come to see and argue is a false binary, that on one side you're an activist and the other you're a scholar. But that kind of tension has informed my whole trajectory and also informed what I'm talking about today. And so enough about that, but I am happy to also discuss that more in the Q&A. So just very quickly, these are the 7 chapters of the book, and so I'm going to be talking about most all of them in some way today, but obviously that will be a quick overview. And so I just wanted to kind of provide this as well to orient people. So water is at the heart of the book, is at the heart of what I'm talking about today, but it is also as much about collective struggle and popular organization as it is about water. And I argue that when we look at water and so-called conflicts around water, there's a lot to be learned there that goes to deeper systemic issues, right? Around market deregulation, extractivism, resource privatization, ultimately our political economic system of capitalism. And also, and unfortunately, we see around the world right now horrific catastrophic flooding, horrific catastrophic fires in other regions. And these are effects of climate change, right? And so also cannot talk about water without talking about climate change. And so what ultimately I discuss in this book is about how people around the globe are organizing for the right to clean, safe water. And as part of that struggle, also, it's an entry point or a manner of also resisting against these kind of global economic structures that have us in the disaster that we're in right now, I would say. So the other thing, and perhaps to this audience, this is less important to note than some others, but lack of access to water is not a given. Certainly, there are places in the world where there is water scarcity, and I'm not suggesting there isn't. But ultimately, the struggle for access to clean and safe water and the struggle against water privatization, which I'll talk about shortly, is connected to human-created political and economic structures. This is not a given. And similarly, it also is not a problem of somewhere else, of over there, of in the so-called global South. Don't have time to kind of unpack the language here. I'm going to be using global South and global North because I think even as those terms have their own problems, it's better than talking about, developed, developing, and this idea that developed only looks a certain way. This project started as one about water, but it quickly also became one about knowledge production and how movement flows and strategies are flowing from the so-called global South to global North, because while things are shifting, especially when I began my PhD in 2015 and began this project, and it still, to some extent, I argue, holds true today, there's there's this idea in transnational social movement studies that movement tactics and strategies flow from the so-called global north to south. And I'm saying that is not the case, has not been the case. And it goes both ways, right? But there's a lot to be learned from movements in the global south. The other thing I just want to note is that when talking about water, this isn't a neutral topic. And in a time when there are neutrality policies being imposed on universities, including at my own university in North Carolina, right? This idea that scholarship can be neutral. Well, that's just not how it works, right? And if we take a political ecology lens, to argue that something or research, right, is neutral or is apolitical is actually itself taking a political stance, because neutrality does not exist. And as the Brazilian sociologist Florestan Fernandes said, for the sociologist, right, you pick. You're either on the side of the oppressor or the oppressed. And so part of my research approach then is considering how my own positionality as a scholar from the global north, a white scholar from the global north, informs the research process. And also, though, understanding that there is a lot that academics and that the academy can learn from social movements. So not just this idea that as a scholar, we're going to study some movement over here and tell them what they're doing wrong or right. And again, kind of can come back to this in the Q&A. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into the data and methods. If someone has curiosity about that, happy to come back to it in the Q&A. But ultimately, the book and what I'm talking about today is really grounded in two cases, one in Brazil and one in the US. The US-based one was more focused on one city, Pittsburgh, but there were national and international and global ties, and one of those included to Nigeria. And so one chapter of the book talks about that, and I'll be talking about that today as well, which is kind of a third case then. So chapter 2 details kind of the water privatization and also water grabbing. And so dams, water privatization, bottled water, all of these things may seem disparate, but they're actually all connected. And as I already said, right, it's also important to see that these problems, Nestle is bottling water in Michigan and in Florida, just like they are in Nigeria. So we see some of these same dynamics, even though they may manifest to differing scales, right? But we see them globally. And corporate power, wealth concentration is wrapped up in all of this. So why do 2 billion people lack access to water that's drinkable? This isn't a given, right? Again, it's political and economic structures have created this. And so it's also really important, and as I tell my students, to think about how there are different ways of viewing the world, and this perspective that we're kind of taught becomes almost naturalized, right? Of businesses and corporations, that just represents one perspective. So I find it really useful to kind of frame what I'm going to be talking about now and the empirical chapters of the book, so chapters 3 forward, with this lens of water grabbing. So there's 6 main forms of water grabbing, as I discuss. So we have privatization of drinking water and sanitation. That's more at the core of chapter 3, the Pittsburgh case. And then there's bottled water, which is connected to Nigeria and our rights struggle there, which I'll talk about later on. And then water for extractive industries such as mining, and land grabbing for big agriculture, and then large dam constructions, which is at kind of the core of the Brazilian case. And then finally, financialization, trading water on Wall Street, which has been happening for a few years now. That 6th form really brings these other forms together. And I think we can argue that financialization of water really represents the privatization of life. There's scholarship around how water privatization in general has been tied to larger neoliberal reforms, and obviously also then is about power and who has decision-making power. And so it's not surprising then that campaigns and movements opposed to water privatization or other forms of water grabbing are often linked to the fight against privatization in general, right? Neoliberalization in general. And then also increasingly we see these efforts being framed as efforts against climate change because they're linked. And then finally, as I have already briefly noted, that this dominant paradigm of transnational movement studies in the US being focused on this idea that things kind of flow, quote, from the West to the rest, and like really challenging that idea. Another term I want to just quickly note, because it informs how all of these cases link together, is this idea of translocal organizing. And so I use Bobby Banerjee's definition here, which is local communities living and dying in so-called democratic societies, but governed in very non-democratic ways that are engaged in conflicts with both the state and the market, and sometimes even with civil society, while also making connections with other resistance movements in different parts of the world. And so I argue that that is what we see happening with these water movements. Pittsburgh case, for example, very locally based in one city, but yet making these connections with movements globally. And hopefully this will become clear as I move along here. So with that, kind of going to jump into the Pittsburgh case, which is titled "The Grinch Stole Our Water." And I will explain where that title comes from in a bit. Translocal resistance for the right to water. So a few more definitions here, just to make sure. I think with this audience, probably people are familiar with public-private partnerships, but want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So in the public interest defines public-private partnerships as that public-private partnerships, or P3, is an imprecise term used to refer to different types of contractual arrangements between a governmental entity. So, right, this could be the public water system, for example, and a private entity. There's a lot of documented risk. There's a lot of studies showing the documented risk of P3s, and some of them are noted here. But in general, we can say water quality over the course of 3 to 5 years, water quality goes down, prices go up, there's a loss of transparency. And Veolia is now the world's largest water privatization firm. When my research started, Suez and Veolia were still separate, and so the two of them were the largest. But since then, they have merged, right? So as the screen shows, in 2022, the merger became finalized. And so Veolia's profit for the year grew to $1.2 billion and is now the largest private water operator in the world. Like many other cities in the US and in the world, there's aging infrastructure. And this is also connected to austerity, neoliberal reforms, and disinvestment. And so that is not a unique problem to Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority, which is the main public water system that supplies most of the water to most of the residents in Pittsburgh, was plagued by a lot of problems that came out of the 2008 financial crisis. And they lost around $100 million because of investing in risky interest rate default swaps. So, like many other water systems, what PWSA did to fix those problems was seek help from a private firm, and they entered into a P3 contract. And this occurred in 2012. PWSA hired Veolia to manage operations, and the contract said Veolia would get to keep 50 cents for every dollar saved under its management. And what happened is that it kind of caused a lot more problems. So while Veolia was managing PWSA, there were significant problems in billing and overcharging. There were actually a couple class action lawsuits that ended up getting settled out of court, and it's too convoluted to talk about that here, but I can answer questions later and do discuss it a bit more in the book. But the really big thing that happened that was the kind of starting point for all of the organization, the social movement organization, was that in 2014, Veolia switched a corrosion control for the water. And so they made this switch to a cheaper chemical to save money. They did it without going through proper channels or getting permission from the state, like equivalent to the EPA, the Department of Environmental Protection. And so this cheaper chemical is more caustic and more lead starts leaching out of these old pipes. Ultimately, as noted, right, they settled out of court. Veolia never admitted blame, but City Controller Michael Lamb, in his later audit of PWSA, found, right, cost savings from reduced staffing at the lab were part of what kind of created this fiasco. So when PWSA sent notices to over 80,000 homes in 2016 that there was a lead in the water problem. My own house tested at 100 parts per billion. For context, anything over 15 parts per billion, the EPA says needs remediation, and really there's no safe level of lead, especially for children or pregnant people to consume. And so our water campaign kind of emerged out of another existing coalition that had been called the Clean Rivers Campaign, that was more working to clean up the problem with dumping billions of gallons of sewage into the rivers. And this coalition came together with close to 20 different organizations connected to different environmental justice, racial justice, reproductive health, labor, worker justice, and some so-called mainstream environmental groups as well, like the Sierra Club. And basically, Pittsburgh was able to mobilize and use this idea that we don't want to be another Flint, and that one of the solutions on the table from the mayor and other local officials was to enter into another private-public partnership. And our water campaign said, no, that a PPP is what got us into this problem in the first place. We're not going to, that's not the solution. So Water Trade Journal noted that the Pittsburgh kind of public relations disaster was the reason why Veolia stopped engaging in PPPs in the U.S. Water is still public in Pittsburgh with PWSA. Lead levels are below, that is a typo, shouldn't be before, below minimum. The lead line replacements continue, and in fact, Pittsburgh has been upheld as kind of a case study, a victory in replacing lead pipes. Veolia is still in the water privatization business, right? They're the largest firm now. And in 2019, rumblings started around the idea that Veolia was one of the companies bidding to try to privatize the water system in Lagos, Nigeria. And our water campaign, members from our water campaign, including me, were invited to attend a summit in Nigeria. And I'm going to talk about that in one second, but I wanted to first show here. So there was an action held around the holidays where Veolia was represented by someone dressed up as the Grinch, and our water campaign took all of the different like so-called Christmas carols and changed the lyrics into lyrics about how Veolia was poisoning the water and was the Grinch. And this drew a lot of attention to the problem and was just kind of a creative sort of action. In general, what organizing looked like in this fight to keep water public was a lot of trainings, a lot of public education, door-to-door knocking, educating people about the lead problem, helping direct them to resources where they could get a filter, education around, for example, you shouldn't boil water for formula because that increases the lead in the water, explaining that a PPP and P3 was a form of privatization, holding trainings, talking about that, and then organizing people to go meet with local leaders, including city council and the mayor, some of whom were arguing that a public-private partnership wasn't really privatization, when we know that arguably for water, it's one of the worst forms of privatization because it turns all the risk to the public side and all the profit to the private side. There was also a yard sign campaign just to kind of bring visibility. And so our water campaign was seen as as a success in cleaning up the lead, keeping the water system public. And so when an organization in Nigeria, Our Water, Our Rights, started organizing against privatization efforts there, they invited to the summit people from around the world, including people from Pittsburgh and also from Flint, who had experienced failures of water privatization, and specifically failures of water privatization with Veolia. I think a lot of folks don't realize that Veolia, even if it was to a smaller extent, is also implicated in the Flint, Michigan water crisis as well. So this is a picture of the summit from Nigeria's water emergency from resistance to real solutions against corporate power. This was held in January 2019 and organized by Our Water, Our Right, and the organization that's now called CAPA, or Corporate Accountability Public Participation Africa. When Pittsburgh participants arrived in Abuja, Nigeria, because that's where the summit was held, we got through customs and were greeted by this sign here that you can see this shell symbol over here. So Nigeria International Petroleum Summit. And it was interesting because the hotel where the water summit was had people who were participating in this petroleum summit staying in the same space. And in some ways, I think it was an example of these kind of competing worldviews about how the world should be structured. And on the one hand, privatization and polluting water, and on the other, that water is something everyone deserves to have access to. So as one of the summit participants noted, the only way to defeat corporate power is people power. And someone else said, all of the polluted waters in this country have been privatized by polluters, especially in the Niger Delta. And we can argue, and I would argue, right, that this lack of access to water is a form of slow violence, or Rob Nixon's idea that violence isn't just someone being shot or killed by a bullet, right? It is also a child dying because they drank water that was polluted. Again, this goes back to, we've created this world with these social and political and economic structures that create violence, even if sometimes or oftentimes it is invisibilized. So it kind of is hard to see on the screen probably, but on the left, this was a slide from at the summit. It says mobilize international solidarity, and then talks about the targets, including, the World Bank, but also US Congress. And this was a social media post from Our Water campaign in Pittsburgh saying how Our Water campaign, right, stands in solidarity with the global movement against privatization of our most basic need, water. Pittsburgh stands in solidarity with Nigeria. So these are some different quotes from participants from the US at the summit. And I'll read them, although you can read them as well. So as one person noted, we can't drink the water here or in Flint or in Pittsburgh, that's shared, so we need to think about it globally. I'm thinking about what's going on and how I'm going to put a global spin on everything now. Someone else said, corporations want us to feel small and like we don't have power, but when we come together, we do have power. And someone else noted, a different way of seeing the world leads to a different way of organizing. And so what I argue is that this is an example, this is a space of translocal resistance where people are coming from very different places in the world and they're organizing against the same corporate actors, but they're also sharing experiences. And part of, and for sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail of this here, but it was also the example from a lot of the Nigerian activists saying it's really important that our government and that Veolia sees that other people from other places in the world are paying attention to what's happening here, right? That we're not alone. So this is a quote from chapter 6 of the book, where I am talking about how these translocal spaces ultimately, right, are part of this larger, if we want to call it, right, anti-capitalist or counter-hegemonic project that we can see success happening. And part of it, I'll read just the last part here, is that the work described here is about creating new forms of living and relationships in the present moment, a piece of which includes people developing shared understandings of oppression and exploitation and becoming leaders in their communities to stand up together against greed and for the right to survive and thrive. The potential transformative capacity of that ought not to be overlooked. And so Our Water, Our Right in Nigeria continues to fight and build power today. They've expanded to be more continent-wide, with 8 countries being a part of Our Water, Our Right, including Nigeria. And the campaign continues. And in 2021, they created a 24-page booklet entitled Africa Must Rise and Resist Water Privatization. And so far, the water has not been privatized there. But I'm going to turn now quickly, because I know I'm running short on time, to another part of the struggle and the struggle against water grabbing, which are dams. And so since the 80s, there have been discussions about the social, agrarian, and environmental impacts of large dam projects, and there have also been resistance movements fighting those projects. So this is what I talk about in chapters 4 and 5 specifically. And the focus in those chapters is on the popular Brazilian social movement of people affected by dams. So this is a photo of their flag hanging up in the main office in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And so it says Movimento dos Atingidos por Barragens, which is movement of people affected by dams. Brazil, so in Brazil, and then water and energy aren't commodities. And these are little like buttons from different labor unions and social movements, mostly from the Americas, but also from around the world, that kind of, I think, show the global transnational aspect here. Mabi is an autonomous movement linked to struggles around dams globally, and also is part of forming a movement by the same name in the Americas that links struggles and people fighting against the socio-environmental impacts of dams across the Americas. But they're also bridging and building connections in the continent of Africa, in particular in Mozambique right now, and in Asia as well. And increasingly, their work is very focused on climate justice struggles and to extractivism, because a lot of the dams in Brazil aren't dams just for hydro energy, but they're tailings dams connected to mining, needed for mining various minerals, including and especially iron. They're also a part of what's considered the largest transnational social movement in the world, La Via Campesina. And so there's a little bit on this slide about La Via Campesina, but it is considered the world's largest social movement. There's 182 member organizations in 81 countries that represent over 200 million people, and one of them is Mabi. And you may ask, well, why is a movement fighting around dams connected to a food sovereignty movement? And the very short answer is because when you dam a river, they displace people, right? They displace people, in particular peasant communities and indigenous communities, from their farmland along the rivers and from their livelihood. I also just want to note there's often a conception that dams are sustainable, and they're not necessarily, right? There's immense socio-environmental impacts, but they do also emit greenhouse gases. There's one study that has shown that actually reservoirs emit around 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide yearly. For context, that's more than the entire country of Canada. On the other hand, free-flowing rivers trap carbon and also just are, in general, create a more resilient ecosystem. So this is a photo from the dam collapse, Brumadinho, that happened in 2019. It buried 270 people alive in mud. This article from the New York Times is kind of showing that there was this large payout. And in some ways it is a victory, but from the perspective of many social movements who continue to fight today, $7 billion, A, isn't enough in reparations, but B, that money doesn't necessarily go to the people who are most impacted, in part because it can be really complicated for people to kind of be incorporated into this political system that we have and show that they have legal title to the land, even though their families have lived there for generations. And so what Mabi argues is that it's not just that dams are the problem. Everyone understands that there's a need for energy and it has to come from somewhere. But ultimately what they're saying is that the model, who's getting the energy, who's benefiting, who is making decisions, who is left out. And so what Mabi is fighting for is to build a popular energetic model for Brazil, to not build more dams, to give reparations to those harmed, and to make sure that for the hydro dams that are generating energy, that energy, that people have energy there in Brazil. So Brazil pays really high energy cost, way more per megawatt than we do here in the US, and yet they're producing it at a really low cost. So again, it's kind of the question of who's benefiting and who isn't. I'm going to quickly go through a few things that I think highlight the way Mabi organizes. So on the left, this is Nisinha, presente, 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 mulheres, água e energia não são mercadorias, which means women, water, and energy aren't commodities. And Nisinha was a member of Mabi who was murdered. And unfortunately, this is a story that is too common. People fighting for their livelihood and for life, and losing their life in that struggle. And in trainings and meetings, her memory and those of others in the more distant past and more recent past are held up and honored. And part of how this is done is through something called mística, right? And so storytelling and honoring the memory of people who fought for this struggle for land, for water, for a better world, and using that as, I guess we could say, hope or inspiration to continue in the present. And so this idea of consciousness raising is a really, really important part, popular education, a really important part of Mabi's struggle. And I argue something that I think is really important to think about or even apply to social movement struggles here in the US, because this popular basic education is needed because we don't learn this in our education system typically, right? The other important part of how Mabi organizes is really working to include people who historically have been excluded from leadership into leading the movement. And one project that I think beautifully shows this, so you'll see on the left, these are photos of what are called arpaleras, and this art form comes out of Chile, actually, and the Pinochet dictatorship, when people would, predominantly women, would create these kind of tapestries that told a political story, but it was also a covert kind of way to get that story out. And so Mabi has a project across Brazil, people affected by dams across the country, and also including some from other parts of the world, people affected by dams. And they've created a book and a film called Arpaleras Embroidering the Resistance. And the film is available on YouTube for free, and it has English subtitles. But again, this is this kind of idea of popular education and connecting this idea of consciousness raising and leadership, learning history of land and past struggles, to how we build a different world in the present in these spaces, but also imagining the sort of kind of future that we want to see. And so then another important piece to this is learning from water struggles. So Cochabamba Bolivia struggle, as someone said in a training in Brazil, in Mabi, if you don't have water, you don't have anything. And that's something that struggle and others have shown us, right? And I think it shows also these deep solidarity connections that Mabi has built with social movements across the world, and in particular across the Americas. So leaders who are involved in the Cochabamba struggle, for example, have come to Mabi's national conference before and spoken and gifted this tree, actually, that is shown in the photo here. And so in different words, everyone that I interviewed, and in different ways in all of these kind of training, if we want to call them that, spaces, people talked about the importance of how it's a local fight, it's also a national fight, but it's also an international or global fight, right? Because we can't tackle these political economic structures just at the local level, but we have to start there and then make these connections. And so to kind of wrap this up, what I argue is that global communications and social movement organizing are occurring around water in the form of these translocal struggles, and that global North movements, and North should be capitalized, apologies for that, are engaging with and learning from the Global South, with Global South movements playing a very prominent and innovative and important role. And I'm not saying this is new, it's not new. I'm saying this is something that transnational social movement studies coming out of the US has for too long kind of gotten that kind of wrong or ignored that. And then 3, that ultimately the struggle for water as a human right, a public good, a commons, all of those things are different, and we can get into the semantics of that and how those thinking of water as a human right. Also, I think there's some important critiques of that rights discourse, but ultimately here what we see is that movements are using that language of human right because it's something that everyone can kind of quickly understand. It means something other than water being something to profit off of, right? That water shouldn't be a commodity. And so I think there's implications then both for social movement studies and also activism. So one is thinking about new methodological approaches, and I didn't talk as much about that except at the beginning, but can come back to it in the Q&A. But movements don't need to be the object of analysis of scholars, but are rather producers and co-producers of knowledge. And that the standpoint offered in particular by Mobby offers crucial insights into the operation of systems of power and strategies for successful resistance. Ultimately, right, technocratic approaches, the idea that technology can save us, isn't going to solve our problems. We have to kind of, we have to build something new. And so there's a lot of implications then for thinking about that and building transnational or translocal alliances and collaborations that transcend these invented but still very, very real and very much shaping people's lives, national borders. So as I say near the end of the book, through translocal right to water organizing, people from the global North have shared experiences with people in the global South regarding corporate power that results in unsafe water. These interactions challenge nationalist identities and alignments and center resistance to capitalist expansion and exploitation around the world. Translocality also allows for the maintenance of local specificity in line with Banerjee's argument of translocal resistance, understanding what is shared while also acknowledging and centering differences based on class, gender, race, geographic location, etc. The cases discussed in this book exemplify how people are resisting existing power relations and structures based on competition and extraction. And then that is the book there's a, for any talk I give, or there's a event 30 that you can get a discount on it, or get your library to order it. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to questions and discussion.
That's brilliant. Thanks a lot, Caitlin. Bang on time, but also fascinating talk. I particularly like the way you opened up here and discussed a bit the links between activism and academic scholarship, and that there's this, we got to overcome this kind of divide of, that we think as academics, we just look at activism from the outside, analyzing it objectively in inverted commas, and also actually our movements are actually producing knowledge in their struggles. Yeah, and that's also often overlooked in academia, not just, I would argue, in the United States, but also elsewhere. Fascinating. So thanks a lot for that, Caitlin. Now, we still have about 40 minutes for questions, answers, comments. Please feel free to highlight. It would be best if you raise your hand electronically, and I've seen that Omir has already done so. So over to you for the first question, please. Sorry, you are muted, so we can't hear you.
Sorry. I'm
Oh,
really
good
sorry.
now.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to the organizers and especially Caitlin for this fascinating study. Just reminding us again, are we outsiders? Are we not part of the victims of capitalism or water grabbing specifically? So I conducted a PhD study about the small hydroelectric power plants in Turkey. So you just classified instances of water grabbing, and I saw that small type hydraulic power plants without storage are not part of the list. Do you find them do you find them a part of water grabbing and the resistance as a counter movement against water grabbing? And the my second question is drawn from my case study. We were just chatting about the link between right to water and right to energy. So, the hydraulic power plants were built or have been trying to be built for energy production. And one of the leaders of the movement say that people will talk about right to energy in maybe 10 years. So when it comes to right to energy, there is a risk that somebody can say that, so if you talk about right to water, then what about the energy rights of the people? What about the energy rights of the locals, workers? So I think we should how can I say, draw a dividing line about, as you said, who's a right to energy, and more studies about right to energy is, I think, valuable so that it cannot be captured by the capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Ömer. Caitlin, do you want to get back to that right away?
Yeah, so thank you for both of those questions. So I'll answer them in order. So I think that in terms of small hydro projects, I will, kind of be transparent in that it's something I've definitely thought about, but it hasn't been that small hydro projects aren't kind of what Mobby is struggling against. And so I think that my tentative preliminary answer would be that small hydro projects could be a form of water grabbing in some cases. And also we could see examples of it potentially, or in theory, that are actually community controlled, right? And actually a more sustainable way of obtaining water and energy needs, right? But in the particular case you're talking about, since I don't know the details of that, I don't know, and I would love to talk with you more about that. I think, right, in general, when we're talking about one of the forms of water grabbing, it is speaking to these large kind of hydro dam construction. So I think we are in a moment where, coal, fossil fuels, those are dirty forms of energy. So what do? Solar has problems, wind has problems, so does hydro. Can we see kind of micro hydro projects where there's less socio-environmental devastation? Probably, right? I'll leave it at that piece at that, I guess, for now. In terms of right to water and right to energy, so I actually, in the book, talk about this and include some quotes from people in Mobby who Mobby very explicitly sees the right to water and the right to energy as inseparable, and also sees them as, you can't do anything without water. You can't do anything without energy. We need these things to live. And so I think that from the analysis of Mobby, though, they're inextricably linked. Part of that is also that in Brazil, most energy is coming from hydro. So we kind of see that even more so. But the question of who has control, right? That is the question. So again, I think I showed a slide and went through it quickly, but where Mobby's saying, okay, the problem, it's not just that the problem is dams. The problem is dams, but the problem is also the energy model. Who has control? Who's a part of the decision-making process? Who's been left out? And so I think there it's just like we have to be cautious with rights language as well, because it can be a good thing. It can also be a very Western top-down thing. And it also, we see increasingly water privatization firms, including Veolia, using the language, kind of usurping, right, that language of right. So who's saying it really matters, I think, is the takeaway. So I'm not sure that I completely answered your question there, but hopefully I touched on it, and I would love to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Caitlin. Further questions, colleagues?
And Andreas, I haven't been able to look at them, but I know there's some, I saw them coming through questions in the chat.
So I can read one out for you from Karen Ashike.
Okay.
Question, issues for comment. The options for stopping destructive industry from destruction of watershed lands is one of the simplest ways that USA people can stop the permitting processes that are controlled by cities, counties, and states. This is where people, stakeholders, can stop projects that harm trees and therefore water sources. Is this permitting process available to public to make comment, introduce science findings, and discussing human and health impacts? Are such permitting processes available in Africa, South America? Question mark.
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things or different ways to answer that, and I'll try to hit on a few of them and also keep it short so we have time for others. I think the short answer is that it is complicated and it depends. So a lot of so there are processes, and actually Mobby works with some other with other groups and other NGOs and other even government actors at especially local levels. And so I think there is this space for public comment, but it's also a question, and I think this applies in the US too. You're right, especially when it's organized with social movement pressure, we can see this to be one way to stop something, or at least in the shorter term. But also public comment in and of itself, right, isn't going to change anything. So I think one of the things like our water campaign did really effectively is being able to organize people to show up, and PwC has to listen to 50 people give public comment at a board meeting. But before this happened, before the social movement organization happened, no one was coming to those board meetings. And that is also an argument for why we want to keep water public versus privatized, because when it's privatized, they don't have public board meetings. The board meeting is not open to the public. I think that there's not enough time to talk about how let me pull up the question here, because is this permitting process available to public to make comment, introduce science, available in Africa, South America? I mean, every country, right, in those continents has slightly different, has different rules and different processes. So do those processes exist in many places? Yes. Do they not exist in others? There's probably some places where maybe it's a more ceremonial thing, but not really paid attention to. But I think across the board, what I would say is that this can be a starting point, but it has to just be that starting point to maybe stop immediate harm, because even in places where that process exists, it's not getting at the root cause of the problem. It's not getting at the economic, political structures that are driving austerity and neoliberal reforms, right? And I think in the case of Brazil, for example, with Vale, so that's the company that owned the dam that collapsed. Vale was a state-run company, and in the 90s it was privatized. And it's not to say that it was perfect when it was state-run, or that a state-run company inherently means it's going to be great. I'm not saying that. But what we can see is that more of the wealth generated from it went to benefit people before it was privatized, and that there weren't the same worker and environmental, I don't know, devastating effects, right, that happened once it was privatized, where again and again they were told by different regulatory commissions they were in violation, and they made the choice to ignore it. And so I think, could public comment in that setting if it was organized, could have changed something. Possibly, but there would have also, there's the enforcement side as well, right? And so I think it's a really important question, but we could probably spend the rest of the session talking about it. So I know I didn't exactly answer your question, but we'll move on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caitlin. Do we have somebody who wants to raise orally a question? Otherwise, I've got another one in the talk here. Yes, Luis, over to you.
Hello, thank you for that great presentation of your book. Really looking forward to read it, Caitlin. I wanted to know more about the data and methods. I know it's been an extensive research, but also I want to know more about this questioning of the traditional division of labor between activist and scholar. So really looking forward to knowing more. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think I'll answer it in a couple different ways. The first is that, primarily I was utilizing semi-structured interviews and like participant observation. And when I started the project, I thought it was going to be very heavily interview based. I think I had a goal in mind that I was going to do 100 or more interviews. And what I found pretty quickly is that it's kind of the example that it depends on what your research project is. For some, interviews are exactly what you need to be doing. In my case, what I was getting in terms of data information was so much more rich with that was happening in these training settings, right? In meetings, in community events, in marches, et cetera. And I realized that I think one thing I would have actually done differently is done all of that and then at the end gone back and done some interviews because I would have just had much better questions. But I think that also part of my decision to do that was informed by the fact that I was both an actor and a scholar in these spaces. And when I started the project, I felt like I had to compartmentalize, that I had, in order to create rigorous scholarship, I had to kind of like take off my hat of scholar and leave it somewhere when I was, going to be into that like activist or organizing space, and then the reverse when I was there like as a researcher, that I had to kind of take off that activist hat. And what I learned, and I really think I did learn it through my work in spaces organizing in the US, but in particularly with Mabi in Brazil, where for them this kind of binary was a little less important, and they were like, well, no, there's plenty of examples of people who have been who have both of these roles, and it was just not as big of a deal that I was operating in both spaces, as long as, right, being very transparent about it. So I think the danger comes in is if you're a researcher and you're doing research on a movement and they don't know you're a researcher, right? Also, who's going to write about this? That would be very problematic. But I think as long as there's that transparency and everyone's on the same page, that it doesn't have to be, that tension doesn't have to be there. But it's something I still very much struggle with. And for me, my solution was just being very transparent about it, very clear about my process, and very reflexive about it. And so I think it's also the case that I didn't think when I started, so our water campaign that started in formally like January 1, 2017, but Clean Rivers campaign in 2016. And when I first got engaged, I didn't think this was going to be my dissertation project at all. I didn't think it was going to become a book project. I was in Pittsburgh, my own home tested water. I led in the water, and after probably about a year, I realized, wait, it makes sense. Yeah, this is what I want to do. And so I think the other thing that really informed my thinking about it was a lot of, I remember someone in the organization I worked with in Jacksonville, Florida, before I went back to grad schools, telling me like, really, you want to go get a PhD and be in the ivory tower? Like, we don't need someone else studying us. That's not the problem. Like, there's enough research. We know what the problems are. What we need is action. And so I think that in terms of and this doesn't quite, I'm happy to have more of a conversation about the data and method specifically, but kind of my thought process behind it is like, how does my own writing and the way I'm getting knowledge out there help, not help, but it be in solidarity, right, with the efforts of the movement, rather than me just trying to write something to get it in the top ranked journal that's gonna, be good for my career. And I think for me, that has meant, right, sharing what I write, sharing versions of it with social movements. And I know I have had people tell me as a PhD student that like that makes the rigor of the work, it makes the work like less rigorous. And again, my response to that is, well, neutrality doesn't really exist, right? And so as long as I'm talking about in the process for the reader as well, right? For the academic side as well, saying, yeah, this is my process and this is how I did it. And I think I still feel there's a constant tension between like, okay, so I'm going to sit down and just write something else. What good is that doing? And I don't know, but I do know that the movements that the book is about and that I continue to work with have seen have value in writing. And I think it's also trying to make work then that's more public facing and accessible. So I guess I almost would say for me, it isn't so much that it was my data and methods that changed, but more how I think about it and how I write and share the information or the analysis of it. I think that's more where I see kind of the having to really think through this like scholar versus activist role rather than the actual data and methods. But the final thing I'll say to this in terms of methodology, I think it's also part of realizing that there are so many other scholars, we don't necessarily learn about them in the canon, but who have had this approach, whether we want to call it, collaborative knowledge production or anti-colonial, decolonial, feminist approach, but of that, just as on the scholarship side, right, we're producing something, but that's being done, that social movements have something to teach us as well and are producing their own knowledge. And I think that's a big difference, right? Like Mobby, they produce their own, film, reports, like they're doing their own analysis and publishing it. But also our water campaign in Pittsburgh has done that as well, right? Like, and I've helped in that process as well. And I think it's just, it's more the approach to how the knowledge, the lens through which we're creating the knowledge and sharing it with others is really where I see it kind of coming more into play rather than like it changed the way I conduct an interview. Although I will say one thing that happened and I talk about this a little bit in the book, is people in Brazil in particular were like, all these scholars from the global north come and study us and write about what we're doing to an English speaking audience, but we don't know what you're doing there, right? No one's writing about what happened in Pittsburgh in Portuguese. And so like we'd finish the interview and then they would interview me about the water struggle and how we organize. And then so a part of my commitment too has been then to publish things in Portuguese about the Pittsburgh case, because again, with like thinking about how movements flow, it's going both directions. And so yeah, different places and spaces, one thing that works in Brazil may not work in the US, but a lot of things may. And so also sharing how people in Pittsburgh organized, sharing that information and writing about that in Portuguese rather than just, writing about what the movement in Brazil did and writing about that in English. So it's first day back of the semester, so I feel that was a rambly answer, but hopefully it answered a little bit of your question.
Very good. Thank you, Caitlin. I've got a question in the chat from Jeff Goodwin, which I'm going to read out. It seems that platform capitalism is a new emerging form of water grabbing. For example, water required for data processing centers. Have you come across this in your research and activism? How might this be resisted? Thank you for a great talk. The book looks terrific.
Thank you for that question. Well, so in this book, I don't talk about that because even though I guess probably rumblings of it were happening, the whole question of how AI, ChatGPT and other platforms are using so much water, that wasn't quite, that kind of started happening after, right? I will say that it's something I'm teaching a lot about now, and I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to it. And it is something that makes me feel a lot of, it's hard to feel hope around some of these things, right? And how we resist it. But I think a piece of it, it does go back to knowledge production. And in general, I would say in all the cases I'm talking about, a big component of it was public education, right? Was whether that's in our water campaign, door knocking, and talking, like having conversations with people about what is going on, and also what are the forces that are creating it. So in this case, Veolia, and why another public-private partnership isn't the solution. And in Mobby, right, teaching people about history of what's happened before, of people and successes who have resisted, of envisioning the sort of world we want to create. I think, and I find myself falling into this trap too. It can feel really hopeless and like the world is just a disaster and there's so much cruelty, and there is. But I also think in most places, maybe almost everywhere, we have education systems that intentionally aren't teaching people what's going on. And one of those things is with AI. So my students, right, they're overworked, they're working multiple jobs, they're taking 6 classes. It's really appealing to just use ChatGPT to do your thinking for you, especially when you haven't really been taught how to think critically. So I think a part of how we combat education alone is not going to create the people power to change something, but I think it is a step in it. So I think we need to talk about these things. And yeah, the massive amount of energy and water that are connected to thinking about, AI is just, it's frightening. So yeah.
Thank you, Caitlin. Further questions, colleagues? I think while we wait for colleagues to raise their hand, that there was an interesting discussion about these small hydropower projects, and I think there's been some research when it comes to Serbia in Europe, where on the one hand these projects are pushed as clean green energy, whereas on the other hand they are actually, even though they are very small hydropower projects, they're quite destructive in some of the last natural rivers in Europe, and actually being heavily contested by the local population who don't see the advantage of it. So that could be, for colleagues who are interested in that, looking at Serbia and Europe could provide further insights in this respect. Right. But without further ado, Catherine, over to you for your question.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Great presentation. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your success stories, about how things do change. You were mentioning different initiatives and so how it works basically. You mentioned Pittsburgh, and if then other places could learn from these success stories.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I can definitely speak to it. And I also, just to the point Andreas just made, and mentioning Serbia in particular. So in 2020, January 2020, so right before the pandemic, Mobby organized an international gathering to show solidarity for the 1-year anniversary of the Brumadinho Dam collapse. And one of the participants who came was someone from Serbia was involved in activism around dams there. So it just kind of, again, pointing to that translocal, I guess, resistance. And I will say, and maybe in part it is digging deep for hope, but I think what other choice do we have is that part of the success story, I think, or victories, right, to talk about that, are the fact that people on all different corners of the globe are fighting for a different world and are fighting against these projects. And I think it can seem like we are so isolated because in our own specific spaces or communities, you know, there's only a few people maybe a part of the campaign or the movement. But in all those different small spaces around the world, there's other, you know, small spaces, and some of them not so small, with people organizing. And so what happens when we start to think about it that way and find each other and make these connections? For something more concrete, you know, so in the Pittsburgh case specifically, there was a mayor, we had a mayor at the time who had really kind of talked about how he was anti-privatization. And then it became clear he was having kind of conversations with the gas company, which was a privatized gas company that wanted to in turn get into the business of water privatization. So there's this whole thing called People's Water, People's Gas and People's Water. And we, you know, our water campaign started really organizing around this and having meetings and pressuring him and saying, look, and also doing the education piece of like, no, public-private partnership is a form of privatization. It is perhaps the worst form. And there were a lot of different, it included kind of every different sort of, I think what we think about as typical organizing tactics in the US. So a petition saying we don't want water privatized, going to city council meetings and PWSA board meetings and giving public comment, the yard sign campaign, some direct actions as well, and ultimately then visiting local state representatives, city council, and the mayor, and getting them to sign a pledge saying that they would not privatize the water. And it actually kind of came as a surprise when it seemed he wasn't going to sign it, and then he signed it. And I think the only reason he did was because there were enough constituents who, you know, this was an important issue. And then it was interesting, he ended up losing re-election, but the person who won, there were a lot of issues going on, but water kept coming up as well as the topic of keeping the water public. And it was something that that was a part of the campaign. And I think it's not that a mayor or any elected official signing a pledge means they're going to do it, but it can be something to then have and use to hold them accountable to follow through with what they said they were going to do. So I think that was, you know, one win. Outcomes, social movement studies tends to be, for good reasons, for understandable reasons, really focused on outcomes. But the thing that's tricky is that it can be really actually hard to measure an outcome. Like I don't have the evidence to be able to prove there isn't a counterexample or a scenario where our water campaign didn't exist to see what would have happened, right? But I do think, and at this point, there's not just like my own writing and scholarship, but various sources out there kind of crediting the fact that both the water in Pittsburgh stayed public and that it in fact didn't become another Flint, right? The lead lines, even before it became a part of kind of the Biden infrastructure package and talking about lead line removal on a more national scale, way before that, Pittsburgh was cleaning up and removing those lead lines. And so I think like both of those things, it's a smaller scale and it's not complete, but are success stories. And I think the summit in Nigeria also in the fact that the water has not been privatized there yet, right? Again, I can't prove that it would have been had there not been this social movement presence, but I do think that companies will often, right, they're going to make a decision of like, well, just like they noted, well, we're not going to do P3s in the US anymore. And this water industry journal, so it wasn't some kind of progressive journal, it was a water industry journal, noted specifically the public relations disaster in Pittsburgh as the reason Veolia stopped engaging in P3s in the US. And so I think when companies see, okay, the light's on us, people are paying attention, they're maybe more likely to try to go do it somewhere else. And then that is why this translocal resistance and making these global connections, even as organizing is locally based, is so important, because what we don't want is to just ship that injustice somewhere else. And I think right now that's often what's happening, right? And so I'll leave it at that, but I think happy to also continue the conversation. Feel free to email me. Other questions?
Excellent. Are there any other questions? We still got 10 minutes, so there's space for a couple of questions. Who would like to raise issues?
I mean, I can just speak to the last thing in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's
Karen.
good.
So yeah, I mean, I didn't go into detail in the talk, but actually one of the big, at first, actually, I would almost say one of the obstacles was actually the local health department in Pittsburgh that was trying to kind of argue that lead from water wasn't nearly as big of a concern as, right, like lead in paint or lead in soil. But ultimately, there were people and organizations engaged in public health who were part of this struggle. And so that was one of the angles as well, is that, yeah, this is a public health issue. And again, kind of that education process, but then I think we can't expect the goodwill of people who have power to, once presented with the right information, they're going to do the right thing. That isn't right what happens. However, if you present the right information, the correct information, especially in terms of in the community, and then the people with the decision-making power, especially when they're elected, have a whole bunch of people showing up outside their door, holding public actions, et cetera, then we can see cases of leveraging change. Yeah, so leave it at that.
Catherine, follow-up question.
Sorry, I was just wondering if Trump would make a difference, or if it's a local level.
Yeah, I wondered if I was going to get that question. Yeah, I mean, so I'm working on another related but different project with a few other folks right now, connected to the fact that, so one of the things like activism in the US didn't really think about is what happens to these lead pipes once they're removed. Well, the short answer is they get shipped elsewhere in the world to poison people with lead there, right? I mean, to kind of put it so bluntly. And I think that, but the whole question now with the part of this, the infrastructure package with Biden was all of this money to remove the remaining 10 million homes that lead pipes in the remaining 10 million homes that had them. And yeah, what is going to happen with that, right? Is it going to continue or not? Is just for one kind of small thing, a question mark. But I do think that there is a tendency to think that, okay, if there's someone, because in the US, we don't really have an actual left, certainly not an organized left. And so, okay, we have someone who's more centrist in power, that things are going to be okay, when actually all of this systemic violence, this slow violence, this violence that the US, supports around the world continues. And so I think, is it going to be a more repressive environment for organizing? Absolutely. Is it a setback? Absolutely. I think rightfully a lot of people have a lot of fear around what it's going to look like in terms of cracking down on organizing and activism and suppression. But I think that also it's why it becomes even more important to say, okay, people power matters, and we're going to continue to organize at a local level against these global and systemic structures. But, I intentionally am hopeful in this book and in general when I talk about this issue of water, because I think the other option is despair. And I think that is almost like the easy way out, right? We all have a responsibility to do what we can in our different roles to fight to create in solidarity the world that we want to see. But we also see a trend, I mean, globally, of more reactionary right-wing governments. And I think in some ways that is a response to the fact that power isn't gonna give it up without a fight. And that is where we are. We're in a moment where things are crumbling and being dismantled. And unfortunately, I think the people who did the least to cause the problem, including, right, with climate change, like it's all gonna get worse with Trump. And it remains to be seen just how horrific, but I think this, as Mommy says, right, the struggle continues. So yeah.
Good. So we've got two final questions. First Elif, then Ömer. I suggest you raise your issues one after the other, and then we give Caitlin the final word in that seminar. Yeah, so first Elif and then Ömer, please.
Okay, thank you. I also think that is a fascinating talk. My question is related with social movements and the political sphere. I was curious to hear more about your experiences or your observations based on your fieldwork about which agency the activists in the social movements resort to in claiming water as commons. So we know that there is this social movement rhetoric that keep somehow that is sometimes skeptical about using classical political agency. So could you elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
Okay. And Ömer?
Thank you. My question is about a concept you have drawn on in your research, the concept of translocal movements. So does it just imply a geographical differentiation, a kind of solidarity between two grassroots movements based in two different countries? Or are you just using this concept as an alternative to transnational movements, which you find, as I have drawn from your speech, Western-based and top-down concept. So you say that from west to the rest. So is it a provoking alternative usage, or does it you have no such intention and it just implies geographical differentiation? So I found this concept very kind of very creative and very fruitful. Thank you again for your research and for your presentation.
Okay, thank you for the question.
Final word to you, Caitlin.
Okay, so very quickly here. So I think, right, in terms of agency, like social movement rhetoric, I'm not sure I fully understood the question, and I would ask you to clarify, but I don't know that we have time for that. So
we have.
Okay, could you, Elif, could you quickly clarify what you were asking? Because I want to make sure I get it right.
Sure. In terms of the relationship of these activists with trade unions and political parties, gotcha. Could you observe organic links to shape the political sphere to claim commons? Thank you. I hope that now it makes more sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah, and so I mean, I think the first thing I'll say is that in terms of a commons, that wasn't language that our water campaign, it was more like public good, right? Versus than commons. I think in the case of Brazil, there is more, at least in some spaces, more thinking about it as a commons. But I think we could have a much longer conversation here, but ultimately, I think where I kind of fall is that like I saw examples more so in Brazil than in the US, but where trade unions were a part of this struggle. In the US, it was more on paper. They weren't actively involved, right? And in Brazil, I think there is more kind of this mentality of, okay, at moments, right, what Mabi is really struggling for is much more, if we want to call it this, much more radical and much more out of maybe this Western top-down framework. But there's still going to be moments where strategically it does make sense to align with leftist political parties, trade unions, and other popular social movements, and that they kind of take the approach of we're gonna go at it from all different places because we need the people power. So I think I saw that much more in Brazil than in the US, where there was much more of kind of almost just these divisions, right? Of even if on paper people were, I think, trying to work and did work more with each other than I've seen in a lot of struggles, I think some of those divisions existed a bit more. That's my short answer. For translocal, thank you for that question. So I would say it's a little bit of both. I don't suggest that we should completely eliminate the term transnational. For example, when we're talking about corporations, right, they're transnational corporations. But I think that the term really, in addition to being, we want to say like Western top-down term, it also centers the nation state, which may be no surprise, right? Because of where that concept is coming from. But so translocal is decentering the nation state, while still saying that matters, but also saying that movements, communities, people, like that all of those actors, I don't love that term, but it's the one that's coming to mind right now, matter just as much. And so it's kind of decentering that idea of the nation state. And so when thinking about movements in particular, and the movements I'm talking about, translocal really makes sense in a way that transnational doesn't. But I would say there are still moments where using the term transnational still might make sense. But ultimately, that translocal is getting more at kind of these liberatory spaces that are people in different places in the world, maybe sometimes fighting a very localized struggle, but realizing that it's still connecting to these larger global political and economic structures.
Okay, thank you very much, Caitlin. That's a great moment to finish this excellent seminar, a fantastic start to our spring seminar series. So let's thank Caitlin in the usual manner.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. And as I mentioned, we are a membership-based research institute. So in the chat, you can find a link with a bit more information for that. But thank you very much for your participation, for the excellent question, and especially thank you to Caitlin for the fascinating presentation.
Thank
Good
you
evening,
all.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Great. Bye.